Over Redemption Creek, the air had an odd, fragile silence. This wasn't a peaceful quiet. It felt expectant, similar to a breath held before a scream. Mailing sensed the chill on her skin, not from the late autumn chill, but due to the metallic smell coming from the northern wind. The sky, resembling a dull pewter dish, was vast and disturbingly cloudless. Still, it seemed weighty, bearing down on the harsh, wide plains of West Texas. Within her dwelling, carved into the slope of a low earthen mound, a small fire blazed stubbornly in the stone fireplace. Her 8-year-old son, Bao, sat close to the flames. He carefully arranged dried beans into tidy little stacks, his entire world reduced to this warm, lit circle. Mailing walked from the only deeply recessed window to the solid oak door. She touched the cool, sturdy wood, a door that her husband Chin had personally planed and installed. Its thickness could resist a battering ram. She had faith in it. She also trusted the compacted earth of her walls. The walls were several feet thick, insulated by the same soil that others in town struggled to keep out. They were unaware how quickly and harshly they would learn. Just as she fastened the last lock, a voice called out, barely audible against the wind's growing wail. It was Mr. Abernathy, the town's top carpenter, a man whose pride was as solid as his constructions. "Still hiding in your gopher hole?" he shouted from his porch, pulling his collar tight, as squarely built as the clapboard houses he erected. "A proper house ensures that thing won't be your tomb." He made a vague motion toward her low grass-topped roof, which was nearly hidden against the drab terrain. Mailing merely stared at him, her eyes unwavering, expression blank. She did not reply or defend her home, which came from sorrow and knowledge. Her silence itself spoke, a calm conviction requiring no justification. This from a man who constructed his life on appearances, never considering what lay beneath. She nodded slowly once, then shut the heavy door, blocking his mockery and the wind's initial, harsh whisper. Immediately, the outside noise was dulled, overtaken by the fire's crackle and the gentle sound of bean bowls clicking. The interior silence contrasted. It was tranquil. Chin's voice remained vivid and comforting, akin to the fire in the hearth. It frequently visited her during these peaceful, solitary times, like a guiding echo. From a life that seemed both distant and as recent as yesterday, they came to Texas beneath a relentless sun, hammering down on a huge, treeless landscape that appeared to devour the sky. The heat parched the soil into a cracked, dusty surface, and the wind ceaselessly eroded it. Chin, a man whose silent reflections frequently, his thoughts carried more significance than others' declarations. He once stood on the barren property they bought, not in hopelessness but with contemplative interest. "This land is not as the stories describe," he told her one evening, his gaze sweeping the horizon where the sun spread across the plains like a wound. "It is a land of contrasts. It appears mild, but can bite." Mei Ling, weary from the trip and the unfamiliar harshness of their new home, felt a trace of fear. They had exhausted all their resources to arrive here, pursuing the dream of a life they could craft with their own effort. In her view, that meant a wooden house like those so highly regarded by Americans. Chin, by contrast, held a different vision. He recounted stories of his grandfather's home on the lush plateau of Shanxi, a place marked by harsh, windswept winters and blistering summers. "Back there, we didn't fight against the land," he said, his hands carving shapes in the air as though working clay. "We merged with it and existed within its shelter. A yaodong, a dwelling carved from the hillside, staying cool when the sun raged and warm when winter's chill descended." He had studied the gentle slope behind their property. The soil contains a deep, gradual warmth. May it preserve the summer heat for winter, and winter's coolness for summer. It demonstrates patience. We too must be patient and learn its ways. Initially, she met his proposal with her own hesitation. That doubt came from tradition and the need to belong, to be considered refined in this new, critical environment. Still, she believed in him. His reasoning provided a soothing comfort that outweighed her worry about strangers' judgments. This was a unique form of belief, not the belief of prayer, but the belief of an engineer, a farmer who knew that real strength came not from opposing nature but from grasping its powerful, inflexible patterns. Chin's passing was as abrupt and relentless as a flash flood in a dry creek bed. A fierce, swift fever claimed him in fewer than 7 days. This left Mei Ling a widow in a strange land, with a 5-year-old son, a partially drafted plan for a house that lived only in memory, and outlines drawn in the dirt. The town of Redemption Creek responded with pity that was biting and full of condescension. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, came bearing a basket of stale bread and advice that was even colder. "My dear, you truly must allow the men here to build you a decent cottage," she urged, deliberately looking away from the unusual deep hole. Mei Ling had already started carving into the hillside. This kind of burrowing was considered unchristian, not the way civilized people were supposed to live. Mr. Abernathy offered to erect a small shed for her at a reduced rate, a charitable deed that would also serve as a monument to his generosity in the town's common opinion. They saw a fragile, grieving woman making a silly decision, a heathen clinging to foreign habits. They failed to see the oath she had made to Chin. In his final moments of clarity, she had vowed to build their home exactly as he had dreamed it. She would bring up their son in a safe place, protected by the earth around them. That promise turned into her unyielding backbone. The labor was brutal, a constant fight against dense clay and stubborn rock. Her once smooth hands became a map of blisters, calluses, and cuts. She grew used to the weight of a pickaxe, the steady beat of a shovel, and the constant ache in her back. Bo, too young to help dig, brought her water and sat nearby, a quiet little guardian. His trust in his mother was as firm and unchanging as the ground underfoot. The townspeople watched her work. They whispered as she walked through the general store, their looks mixing pity with scorn. "That poor Chinese woman has lost her mind from grief," they muttered, digging her own grave. But as the earthen walls grew deeper, she carefully began to line the inside with flat river stones for the hearth and chimney. A new shape started to form. It was no grave but a shelter, a womb. Once the heavy final door was hung and the roof covered with sod, it looked less like a house and more like a natural, ancient part of the hill itself. Modest and silent, it seemed completely wrong among the majestic, sharp-angled wooden structures of Redemption Creek. A shifting log in the fireplace startled her back to reality. A shower of bright orange sparks sprayed up the stone flue. The wind's moaning had stopped. It had transformed into a constant, deep roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Nearby, Bo had abandoned his beans and was pressing himself against the thick, multi-pane glass of their only window. His breath formed a small patch of fog on the chilly glass. "Mama," he murmured, his voice full of childish wonder. "The sky is collapsing." Mei Ling stepped up behind him, placing her hands on his small shoulders. He was correct. The first snowflakes had arrived, not drifting gently but blown nearly sideways by the fierce wind. They were tiny and hard, like pellets of sand stinging the outside world. Through the thickening white curtain, she observed the town beginning to react. Figures rushed along the muddy street, heads lowered against the sudden onslaught. A horse tied to a post outside the saloon neighed in protest, its mane and tail whipped wildly. There was a burst of activity as people who moments earlier had been mocking the cold now scrambled to secure their homes. Their movements were clumsy, driven by a strange urgency. This was not the cold they were familiar with. Texas winters were known for their harshness, for the brutal blue norther that could drop temperatures by 50 degrees in a few hours. But this was different. It felt primal, ancient, a force unleashed. Inside the dugout, everything was changed. The roar became a deep, reassuring rumble, like a distant ocean, not a threat at their door. The compacted earth walls, which the townsfolk had called primitive, now showed themselves to be excellent insulators. They absorbed the storm's fury and left only a deep, resonant hum. Mei Ling moved around the single large room with calm, practiced efficiency. She checked the seals around the door to ensure no drafts could enter their sanctuary. She added another log to the fire, knowing the night would be long and the cold outside would be deadly. Her eyes fell on their stores, neatly stacked against the far wall. There were sacks of flour and cornmeal, smoked hams hanging from the rafters, and barrels of salted fish. A pile of firewood reached the ceiling. Months of preparation had gone into this, all guided by Chin's remembered warnings about this land of extremes. They had more than enough, and they were ready. The storm did not build gradually. It exploded. The wind's roar escalated into a deafening, demonic shriek. a physical pressure that seemed intent on tearing Redemption Creek from its foundation. Snow no longer fell. It was a solid, blinding river of white flowing sideways, erasing the world and burying landmarks. It transformed the familiar landscape into an alien Arctic wasteland. The temperature plunged into ranges no one in the town had ever experienced. It was a cold that was actively hostile, a thing with teeth that gnawed through wood, glass, and flesh, and the narrative pulled back, a spirit floating on the gale, witnessing the town's desperate, failing struggle. Mr. Abernathy, the master carpenter, fought a losing battle with his own creation. A portion of his roofing ripped off with a noise resembling a cannon blast, and gusts flooded his attic. Indoors, he and his spouse cowered in their living room, their elegant furnishings coated with snow. Their fireplace had been extinguished for ages, suffocated by the gale roaring down the flue. The chill became a tangible force in the space, robbing them of their inhalations, draining vitality from their arms and legs. His arrogance had become ice and broken apart, leaving behind nothing but a naked, trembling fear. Several homes away, Mrs. Gable, the minister's spouse, was on her knees in the floor of her sleeping chamber. An hour earlier, the window had shattered inward, and her supplications were now swallowed by the tempest roar that had breached her residence. The consecrated area was defiled, inhabited by a force far more ancient and apathetic than the deity she venerated. Scripture rested open on her nightstand, its leaves flapping frantically prior to being entombed beneath a heap of thin, invasive snow. The actual emblems of their cultured existence, the sturdy dwelling, the sacred text, were being stripped of significance. The hierarchy of society was being made irrelevant, taken apart by a power that discriminated against none. Yet within the mound, there existed heat and illumination. Mei Ling occupied a short seat, repairing a rip in Bao's garment using the flickering glow of the hearth. The gale resembled far-off underground rumbling, a prompt that the globe's turmoil was kept securely distant. Bao slumbered in his tiny cot, snug beneath a dense blanket. His respiration was profound and steady, and he lacked any fear. Within the core of the ground, there existed no reason for fright. Mei Ling halted her stitching, heeding the profound pulse that constituted the tempest's utterance, softened and subdued by layers of dirt. She experienced no feeling of victory, no contentment in the community's retribution. There existed only a deep, grave thankfulness for the individual who had perceived the reality of this territory. Additionally, a serene fortitude resided in the commitment she had honored. Her dwelling, the village's target of mockery, had transformed into a sanctuary. During 2 days, the universe comprised solely noise and rage. The gale resembled a breathing creature, scratching at the entrance, screaming its fury through the rock flue. Looking inside, existence had discovered a fresh tempo governed by the flames and the diminishing stack of logs. The shelter was a sphere of heat and vitality within a sea of icy demise. After that, on the evening of day 3, a novel noise succeeded in penetrating the tempest's discourse. It was distinguishable from the breeze. There came a subtle, urgent pounding at the exterior door, a noise so feeble it was nearly engulfed by the storm. Bao, who had been drawing shapes in the ashes by the fire, lifted his gaze, his eyes enlarged. Mei Ling placed a digit against her mouth, paying close heed. The noise repeated, a desperate, soft tapping that indicated a vanishing existence. Near their entrance, she grabbed a substantial metal rod from the fireplace and advanced toward the door, each movement measured. Unaware of what despair the gale had generated, she shouted externally, her tone resolute, "Who is present?" A shout replied, ripped apart by the gale, yet she recognized one solitary term, assistance. Removing the weighty latch, she drew the door slightly ajar. The tempest rushed at the gap, a tangible explosion of frozen water and chill so fierce that it knocked her rearward a pace. Positioned within the whirlwind stood a silhouette, encrusted with frost and snow, scarcely identifiable as a person. When it lurched ahead into the illumination, she recognized it as Mr. Abernathy. His once glorious facial hair was a frozen block, his complexion a waxy pale blue. His wife clung to him, her eyes frozen wide with terror. He screamed and dropped to his knees on the dirt floor, his voice a broken rasp. He gasped, "Please," the word lost in a shaking fit. "My house, the roof, it's destroyed. We We're dying." Without a word, Mei Ling just shoved the heavy door shut, blocking out the furious storm outside. The bolt of the bar secured them in safety once more. She gazed down at the man who had once called her home, now a tomb seeking shelter inside its own walls. Her eyes held no victory, just profound, tired kindness. She guided his wife to a stool near the fire and softly started removing the ice from her shawl. Next, she faced her son Bo and instructed, "Get the warm broth." The Abernathys were merely the first arrivals. Their frantic trek through the snowstorm had apparently left a subtle path. Within an hour, more desperate knocks pounded on the door. A final hope. Now it was the preacher, Mr. Gable, his expression a blend of shock and agony. He was helping his wife, whose faith had not shielded them from the freezing cold that destroyed every window in their lovely rectory. Accompanying them were the blacksmith and his two young kids, all cloaked in ice-crusted horse blankets. When Mei Ling admitted them, the bunker, formerly a roomy shelter for two, started to seem cramped. The atmosphere thickened with odors of wet wool, dread, and the gradual agonizing warming of frostbitten flesh. The place turned into an improvised clinic, a common room, a vessel of survival. Mei Ling moved through the group with a calm, unchallenged command. She was no longer the odd outsider. She became the supplier, the guardian. With a pragmatic gaze, she evaluated their states, caring for the blacksmith's kids' black-tipped fingers, bundling Mrs. Abernathy's feet in warm wraps, and serving valuable servings of the nutritious soup she'd made. She taught them the best spots to gather for heat, how to divide the blankets, how to live in this area that now constituted their entire universe. These community leaders observed her, their past convictions erased by the frost. They noticed the tidy piles of logs, the abundant food supplies, the smart chimney structure that extracted smoke without losing warmth. They witnessed a dwelling founded not on vanity or looks, but on profound, modest intelligence. Mr. Gable, with a rough voice, eventually uttered the unspoken thought lingering in the room. "We acted like idiots, Mrs. Chin. We ridiculed what we didn't comprehend." Mei Ling merely nodded, concentrating on feeding more soup to the blacksmith's trembling daughter. Her deeds were her sole response. She didn't require their apologies, but she required them to live. Day 3 merged into day 4. Time stopped being measured by sunlight, which had completely disappeared. Instead, it was tracked by the gradual burning of logs in the hearth. Outside, the world emitted a ceaseless shrill wail, while inside, an odd, solemn society had emerged. The survivors, deprived of their possessions and social rank, were diminished to their basic human nature. In the dancing flames, their faces were pale and marked by the horror of what they had endured. In a brief pause when the wind's howl dropped to a soft rumble, Mr. Abernathy sat gazing at the fire. His hands, those of an expert carpenter, were shaking. He glanced at Mei Ling as she demonstrated blanket patching to Bao. "My entire life," he murmured, his words soft yet audible in the silent space. "Having worked with wood, I believed I understood shelter construction. I designed for rain and sun, but never considered protecting against this." With a vague motion toward the ceiling, the mass of earth and snow shielding them from the storm, he said, "I build above ground, but your husband built within it." He grasped its power, whereas I had always viewed it as a challenge to overcome. Nearby, Mrs. Gable crouched and gave a slow nod. "We believed devoutness served as protection. We condemned your customs as pagan, yet they demonstrated a reverence for God's creation surpassing any sermon I've heard." Mei Ling stopped working and studied the faces lit by the fire she kept. They were no longer the contemptuous neighbors from days past, but a group of scared, humbled individuals. Silently, she addressed Chin in her thoughts. "You see," she considered, "you were correct. You ensured our safety. You protected everyone." This vindication brought not elation, but a profound, sorrowful confirmation of the love and wisdom he had imparted. This legacy weighed heavily, and it now shielded those who had previously mocked it. Then, on the 5th morning, a shift occurred, not abruptly. Rather, it was a slow easing. The relentless shriek of the wind softened, turning into a sorrowful, deep moan. Then over an hour, dwindled to whispers. At last, the silence became so total it was overwhelming. The survivors exchanged glances. Their faces showed a blend of hope and fear, and everything had fallen still. After a lengthy pause, Mei Ling stood up, aided by Mr. Abernathy and the blacksmith, and pushed against the massive door. The door wouldn't move. A huge snowdrift had trapped them. Together, the three pushed with all their might. It gave way a few inches, then with a loud creak, swung inward, releasing a flurry of fine powder onto the floor. An incredibly bright, pure light poured into the shelter, making everyone squint and cover their eyes. Once their sight adjusted, they saw a world that had been wiped clean. Redemption Creek had vanished. What remained was a scene of awe-inspiring, fearsome splendor. Snow lay in huge, carved drifts, reaching the height of the roofs they covered. The sky was a stark, cloudless blue, and the sunshine reflecting off the snow was dazzling. The site of Mr. Abernathy's workshop was now a smooth white hill. The church steeple resembled a shattered wooden lance rising from an ocean of white. The whole town, with its stiff, self-important structures, had been flattened, blurred, and swallowed by the blizzard. The sole indication of people was the dark entrance of the dugout and a slender trail of smoke from its concealed chimney. One by one, the survivors emerged, each sinking into the deep powder. They stood without speaking, observing the magnificent and utter ruin of their surroundings, and within that hush, they all comprehended that this land of extremes had made its statement, sparing only the dwelling that had submitted to it. In the subsequent weeks, the great thaw commenced, and everything melted and trickled, exposing the remains of the old town. Yet the essence of Redemption Creek remained unbroken. It had been reshaped within the earthy comfort of Mei Ling's house. The previous social structures had vanished, losing all significance compared to the immense challenge of reconstruction. Now there existed just one leader, one wellspring of wisdom that counted. On an afternoon when the final snow was thawing from the slopes that faced south, Mr. Abernathy walked up to Mei Ling, hat in hand, with a steady, respectful look in his eyes. "Mrs. Chin," he said, his tone distinct and devoid of its earlier arrogance. We were curious if you'd be willing to instruct us." Mei Ling glanced beyond him at the modest gathering of survivors assembled close by, their expressions full of hope. "Teach you? What exactly, Mr. Abernathy?" "How to construct," he replied plainly. "How to pay attention to the earth rather than yelling at it, how to erect a dwelling that the wind acknowledges." Thus commenced the restoration of Redemption Creek. It did not re-emerge with lofty timber structures and boastful frontages. Rather, a fresh settlement started to form, cradled within the sheltering arms of the hill slopes. Guided quietly by Mei Ling and with Abernathy's expertise, now governed by a novel understanding, they excavated and positioned stone bases. They constructed solid barriers of compressed soil, mastering the technique of the Yaodong, the unhurried reasoning of existing inside the terrain. Mei Ling, once the outsider and the so-called crazy Chinese widow, had transformed into the designer of their tomorrow. After several months, she stood on the hill above their residence, holding a bough. She gazed down at the collection of fresh, low-lying houses, every one emitting a wisp of smoke from its chimney. Though her husband had passed, his legacy persisted, carved into the essence of the earth. It was present in the arch of every new rooftop, in the security of each household.